Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a shadowed corridor of the past, where echoes of misunderstood pain still linger in the margins of old books and forgotten treatment rooms. What we're about to explore isn't just medical history. It's a haunting reflection of how women's emotions, fears, and mental anguish were once viewed not with empathy, but suspicion. Across centuries, from marble columns of ancient Greece to velvet-draped Victorian clinics, women who suffered from what we now call anxiety were often labeled dismissed and, in many cases, punished. Their stories were buried under layers of confusion, fear, and flawed science. Tonight, I want to walk with you through that timeline, not as a doctor, but as a witness to their silenced voices, misunderstood symptoms, and the strange remedies once believed to be salvation. So before we settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into the quieter, often overlooked corners of history, feel free to like the video or subscribe, only if it genuinely brings you value. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always find it beautiful how our small corner of the internet connects people across time zones and lives. Dim the lights, maybe put on a soft fan or some white noise, and let's ease into this journey together. Imagine yourself in a bustling marketplace in the ancient world, the scent of olive oil and incense drifting through the air, and somewhere, tucked away behind the grandeur of temples and forums, a woman is trying to explain something no one understands. Her heart races when it shouldn't. Her breath catches in her chest without warning. She's afraid, often for no reason she can name. But when she tries to speak of it, the response isn't comfort. It's confusion, diagnosis, and not the kind that helps. Our story begins in ancient Greece, the cradle of philosophy, democracy, and medicine. But even among thinkers like Hippocrates, the man whose name would later become a symbol of ethical care, the inner world of a woman was something of a mystery. To a healer of that time, if a woman trembled, wept, or felt unwell without a visible wound, the explanation was not emotional distress. It was the idea that her uterus, a rebellious organ, had grown bored or unsatisfied and begun to roam freely throughout her body. They called it the wandering womb. This belief wasn't fringe. It was foundational to how ancient Greek doctors understood female biology. Her anxiety wasn't a sign of trauma or psychological suffering. It was her uterus acting like a restless spirit, drifting through her body and throwing everything into chaos. Imagine being that woman, lying on a woven mat in a dusty room while a healer holds pungent herbs to your face, hoping that the uterus, like a stubborn cat, would be enticed back to its proper place by sweet smells and discouraged from further travel by offensive ones. Treatments were more theatrical than therapeutic. Burning garlic beneath her nose, perfumes near her hips, and all of it conducted with an air of confident ignorance. No one asked how she felt. They only asked where her womb might be hiding. It's strange to consider, but in a world that had birthed philosophy and debated ethics under the stars, a woman's emotional suffering was reduced to the misbehavior of a single organ. Her tears weren't seen as signs of grief or stress. They were errors of the flesh, misfiring parts. And so began the long tradition of reducing female emotion to physiology, of treating mental pain with physical control. As time marched forward into the Roman Empire, filled with aqueducts and marble forums and laws etched in stone, one might hope for progress, but medicine for women remained an echo of older ideas. Anxiety had no name, only symptoms, and those symptoms were still thought to be signs of a womb underemployed. The prescription was marriage, or pregnancy, or both, quickly. Because a woman who had no child was seen as a woman whose body and mind would soon betray her. Even their language betrayed this belief. Roman doctors referred to the female emotional state as furor uterinus, a phrase that sounds more like a military formation than a diagnosis. If a woman cried too easily, disagreed too often, or simply failed to perform her societal role with quiet grace, she might be accused of moral or spiritual failure. The solution was never introspection, it was childbirth. Again and again, until presumably the uterus had no time to wander and the mind, overburdened with duty, stopped misbehaving. Some physicians tried to soften the blow. One, Soranus, advised husbands to be gentle with their wives, but even this compassion came wrapped in misunderstanding. To be gentle, in Roman terms, was often to tolerate, not to understand. A wealthy woman might be given wine or a lyre to soothe her. But a poor woman, who had no voice and no coin, might be ignored entirely, or worse, accused of spiritual impurity, her suffering viewed not as illness, but as evidence of possession, a crack in the soul where evil could slip in. So if she wept too long for a lost child, or showed fear in the face of cruelty, she might be accused not of being human, but of being dangerous. And what could she do? Deny it and be dismissed, accept it and be condemned. There was no safe place for her truth. What's so painful about this history isn't just the absurdity of the treatments, it's the deep loneliness at the heart of it. These women weren't witches, they weren't hysterical, they were afraid, exhausted, mourning, their minds crying out for care that simply did not exist. And so they were silenced, not with violence, but with condescension. Not with chains, but with disbelief. As we move from the marble halls of Rome into the dim candlelit chambers of the Middle Ages, something chilling happens. The misunderstanding of women's mental health doesn't just persist. It deepens. What once was framed as misalignment or imbalance slowly becomes something darker, more threatening. Emotion is no longer merely misinterpreted. It is feared. And fear, as history often shows us, breeds cruelty. In medieval Europe, the ancient notion of the wandering womb lingered like a ghost, but it now wore a cloak of religious terror. Without the advances of modern medicine, or even the basic curiosity of classical thinkers, emotional distress, especially in women, was seen less as a medical condition and more as a spiritual corruption. If a woman trembled, or spoke of strange thoughts, or wept without cause, it wasn't her mind calling for help. It was evil, they said. It was Satan whispering through her soul. Imagine this. A woman sits alone in a thatched cottage, her husband long buried by plague, her child gone to fever. Her hands shake at night, and the shadows on the wall seem to move in unfamiliar ways. She tells her priest, not because she expects judgment, but because she hopes for comfort. What she gets instead is suspicion, because trembling and sorrow in the world of cloisters and crosses were not signs of grief. They were signs of possession. And so she might find herself before a congregation, not to be comforted, but to be cleansed. Holy water, confession, sometimes isolation, sometimes worse, an exorcism, perhaps even a trial. Because the only acceptable explanation for her pain was the presence of the devil. And if she failed to smile during Mass, or if she bled too long after childbirth, or if her voice carried emotion that could not be named, she might be branded as unnatural, or ungodly, or eventually, witch. The Church had become the primary caretaker of the soul, but in doing so, it often overlooked the mind. Healing was prayer. Diagnosis was confession. Treatment was silence. In monasteries, where some of the first rudimentary forms of care were practiced, women were placed in dark rooms, instructed to fast, to meditate, to pray the madness away. But this wasn't healing. It was hiding. And when hiding didn't work, there were other ways. Rivers, fire, stone cells beneath cathedrals. Imagine the tools they used to confirm a woman's suffering was the work of demons, a silver cross pressed to her skin to see if it burned, cold water to shock the truth from her lips. Long interrogations in front of stone-faced clerics who asked not, What hurts? But who sent you? A woman might wake from a panic attack only to find herself accused of being in league with dark forces, judged not by her words, but by the pitch of her cry or the shape of her shadow. And still, behind every accusation, every punishment, every whispered prayer for deliverance, there was a woman, a real person, sleepless, trembling, trying to make sense of a world that offered no language for her pain, only judgment. No comfort, only consequence. Some nuns, with what little knowledge they had, tried to care. In the cloisters, they wrote of melancholia and divine sorrow, of women too fragile for the world's noise. But even their kindness was limited by ignorance. They could not see the mind. They only saw the soul, and so they prescribed fasting and solitude and long, painful silence. They meant well, perhaps, but meaning well is not the same as understanding. So the centuries rolled on, and in this era of superstition and sanctity, of relics and rituals, a woman's suffering was never just hers. It belonged to God or to the devil, but never to her. And that's the cruelty of it, isn't it? That a woman's pain could not exist on its own terms. It had to be transformed into evil or punishment or divine lesson. Never just grief, never just fear, never just human. The world turns, and with it, a new age dawns. The Renaissance, a time of art, architecture, and rediscovery. Michelangelo chisels life from marble. Da Vinci dreams of machines that fly. Galileo stares through his telescope and rewrites the heavens. Knowledge is blooming like a spring that had been frozen too long. But in all this brilliance, in all this rebirth of human thought, something remains neglected: compassion for the minds of women. For all its genius, the Renaissance carried forward one ancient failure. It could not understand female emotion as real, as valid, as worthy of study or care. Instead, it merely refined old beliefs into more elaborate language. The uterus, that ever blamed organ, still stood trial in the court of medicine. If a woman wept without reason, if she collapsed in fear or could not eat or sleep, the diagnosis was not new. It was simply better dressed. Physicians, now surrounded by anatomical drawings and shelves of Greek and Roman texts, continued to argue that female distress was rooted in physical imbalance. Too much blood, not enough bile, a restless womb. The treatment, it was hardly healing. Women were bled, sometimes with leeches, sometimes by incision. They were cupped, purged, blistered, and confined, and through all of it, they were told it was for their own good, that they were too full of feeling, that they needed to be emptied out. Imagine being a woman in a household of status. You confess to your husband that you feel tired all the time, that your heart aches for no visible reason. You cannot sleep, you cannot smile. The physician arrives and speaks not to you, but over you. He prescribes seclusion, a room with heavy curtains and no visitors. No books, of course. A woman reading might start asking questions, and questions are dangerous things. You're told to lie still, to sip bitter tonics and rest in the dark, not because rest might heal you, but because your silence is more convenient. You're not a patient. You're a problem to be solved without noise. And so your world shrinks, chamber by chamber, until it is no longer a life, but a cage wrapped in silk and sighs. In wealthier homes, the remedies are more elegant but no less cruel. A countryside retreat, they call it. But it's not freedom. It's supervision. You are watched for signs of improvement or for any indication that you are failing at your role. Smile, and they say you're recovering. Weep, and they double the dosage. Either way, the verdict is never yours to give. And for the poor, there is no such illusion. There are no retreats, no herbal tonics imported from far-off gardens. Their anxiety is treated with bluntness, ignored, ridiculed, or punished. Cry too long and you're unstable. Refuse to work and you're lazy. There is no kindness for them, only labor, only survival. Even the thinkers of the time, those who painted the ceilings of cathedrals with wonder and who filled libraries with light, failed to ask the simplest question of all. What if women feel too much because the world gives them too little? What if anxiety isn't a sign of female weakness, but a natural response to relentless expectations and silent grief? But such questions were not fashionable. They were not painted in oils or set to sonatas. So they were not asked, and thus emotional pain, especially in women, was not a wound to be treated. It was an inconvenience to be hidden. So the Renaissance passed, gilded and glorious, and yet hollow in one quiet chamber, the understanding of women's minds. They were expected to be graceful, to be calm, to wear beauty like armor, and speak emotion only in metaphor. And if they broke, if the sadness grew too large for the silks and perfumes to conceal, then they were tucked away like cracked vases behind locked doors. Never shattered, just unseen. The Enlightenment was supposed to be an age of reason, a time when science rose above superstition, when truth was pursued with quills and telescopes, when minds cracked open the mysteries of gravity, anatomy, electricity, and the stars. Philosophers filled salons with ideas about liberty and the soul. Laws were debated. Empires questioned. But while men were busy measuring the motion of planets, the mysteries inside women remained unsolved, and, more often, simply ignored. If you were a woman in the 17th or 18th century, suffering from what we now understand as anxiety, restless thoughts, racing heart, breathless nights, your suffering was politely renamed. You were no longer possessed or wicked. Now, you are simply one of the nervous ladies, a term that sounded gentle, almost genteel. But behind it was the same old silence, the same failure to ask what you were feeling or why. Physicians, almost all of them male, began to speak of the nervous system, of overstimulation, of too much imagination. They claimed women were biologically more sensitive, more delicate. Their emotional turmoil, they said, was simply a matter of faulty wiring, too many nerves, too little control. And so the cause of anxiety shifted from the wandering womb to the unruly spirit. Still within the woman, still her fault. If you broke down, it was not grief, it was overexcitement. If you trembled, it wasn't fear, it was overreaction. A woman with ideas was not inspired, she was overstimulated. A woman who dared to question her world was not insightful. She was fragile. The treatments became quieter, but not kinder. Warm baths, gentle walks, long rests in shaded rooms. You might be encouraged to take the waters at a spa, to listen to music, to avoid anything too intellectually demanding. Because thinking too much, doctors warned, might unbalance you further. And then came the opiates. Tinctures of laudanum, blends of alcohol and opium were prescribed not to heal, but to hush. They dulled the ache, blurred the edges. You still felt hollow, but now you floated. And the world around you, the duties, the disappointments, the ever-tightening corset of expectation, faded into fog. For a time, for the wealthy, nervous retreats were built, quiet manners where women were waited on and discouraged from thinking. For the poor, there were no such escapes. No opium elixirs, no hand-carved chaise lounges by the window, only silence, or accusation, or abandonment. And if you dared to show frustration, if you expressed rage or ambition or exhaustion, you might find yourself labeled dangerous. Not just nervous, but mad. If your husband signed a paper, you could be committed. No trial, no defense, just a quiet removal from society. For your own good, they would say, for the peace of the household. This was the paradox of the Enlightenment. Reason for men, sedation for women. Discourse for philosophers, quiet for wives. The libraries of Europe swelled with volumes on justice, knowledge, and freedom. While behind lace curtains and locked asylum doors, countless women sat in silence, afraid to cry too loudly, afraid to ask, "Why do I feel like this?" They were told to rest, to smile, to breathe, but not too deeply. Never too deeply, because beneath all the new terminology and powdered wigs, the truth remained unchanged. A woman in pain was still a problem to be solved, not a person to be heard. The Victorian era arrived like a well-polished stage, draped in velvet, buttoned tight with decorum, and shadowed by an unwavering demand for order. On the surface, it was elegance personified. Corsets laced tightly, parlors arranged with precision, every teacup in its place. But beneath the lace and manners was a world that feared emotional messiness, especially in women. In fact, women's emotions weren't just dismissed, they were managed, corrected, subdued. If you were a woman in the 19th century who felt anxious, exhausted, or lost within yourself, the solution was not conversation or inquiry. It was control. Welcome to the age of the rest cure, a treatment devised not out of empathy, but out of convenience. Created by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, a physician celebrated more for his social connections than his compassion, the rest cure was marketed as a remedy for nervous exhaustion, a term so vague it could cover everything from postpartum depression to simple sadness. Here's what it looked like. You were taken from your home, or confined inside it. Your books were removed, your journal confiscated. Your writing desk stood silent. No letters, no visitors, no work of any kind. You were placed in a dimly lit room with heavy curtains and instructed to lie in bed. For days, weeks, sometimes months, you were fed rich dairy, told to sleep, told to breathe, but not to speak of your pain. You were not allowed to think, because thinking was believed to agitate the nerves. This was healing, they said, but what it really was erasure. A woman erased from her life, painted over with forced quiet. If she protested, she was said to be resisting the cure. If she wept, they called it regression. If she grew angry, they saw danger. Compliance was health, compliance was peace, and the cost was her autonomy. Not everyone accepted this fate. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a writer and thinker, endured the rest cure herself. When she emerged, she wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a chilling short story about a woman confined to a room, driven slowly mad by the very treatment meant to cure her. In the story, the wallpaper isn't just decoration. It's a symbol of captivity, of how women's emotions were boxed in, papered over, and left to rot in silence. The woman in the story doesn't heal. She unravels. Not because she was broken, but because no one believed she was whole to begin with. Beyond the rest cure, there were the asylums, institutions tucked behind stone walls, where women were placed when rest wasn't enough to suppress them. The criteria for admission? Vague and broad. Talking too much. Crying too often, refusing to smile, sometimes just being too opinionated. Inside these walls, the treatments were far less gentle. Ice baths, electric shocks, solitary confinement, and always observation. A woman's every move was noted, her every mood analyzed, not for understanding, but for judgment. And yet no one asked the essential questions. Had she lost a child? Had she been silenced, abused, abandoned? Was she grieving a life she could never claim as her own? No. Her tears were not explored. They were pathologized. Her fears were not met with warmth. They were measured against expectations she never agreed to. In Victorian society, a woman was expected to be calm, composed, delicate. To break those rules was to risk being hidden away, her anguish interpreted not as signal, but flaw. And thus, many women became performers. They smiled when they wanted to scream. They nodded when they wanted to run. They folded their anxiety into politeness because anything else could lead to a locked door and a long silence. The world was not built to hold their pain. It was built to deny it. By the turn of the 20th century, corsets were loosening, gaslight was fading into electric glow, and in a quiet Viennese study, a man named Sigmund Freud was preparing to rewrite the way we talk about the mind. Or so it seemed. Psychoanalysis, his revolutionary invention, offered an alternative to ice baths and silence. It gave anxious women something they'd never been given before: a couch, a space to speak, to remember, to wonder aloud. For a moment, it felt like progress. Gone were the wandering wombs and exorcisms. Now, the roots of female suffering were believed to lie not in the uterus, but in the subconscious. The mind was no longer just a passive organ. It was a labyrinth of repressed desire, forgotten memory, and unresolved trauma. Especially, Freud believed, from childhood. And while this idea cracked open new paths for understanding, it also came with strings. Because when women arrived at Freud's office trembling, breathless, overwhelmed by life, they weren't asked what had happened to them. They were asked what they were hiding. You see, anxiety was no longer simply a nervous condition. It was symbolic, a code to be deciphered. And behind every symptom, Freud insisted, was something unspoken, something scandalous. Did you fear crowds? Maybe it was sexual repression, nightmares, a buried desire, panic attacks. Likely the result of some unresolved conflict with your father or your mother or your own body. Freud's methods were less violent than previous centuries, yes. No cages, no dunking, no forced seclusion. But they still placed the blame within the woman. Her anxiety wasn't shaped by her culture or her obligations or the ache of living in a world that didn't listen. No, it was shaped by her libido, her guilt, her resistance to the truth, and if she didn't get better, that too was her doing. Perhaps she was in denial, perhaps she wasn't trying hard enough, perhaps her unconscious had constructed defenses so powerful that not even Freud himself could break them. Either way, she remained the problem. Psychoanalysis swept through Europe and into America, embraced by the intellectual elite. And yet, the women who lay on those couches still found themselves cornered, this time not by chains, but by theories. They whispered their dreams, their losses, their fears, while the men with notepads scribbled interpretations, each sigh a metaphor, each silence evidence. A woman could never simply be anxious. Her every emotion needed explanation, excavation. Often she was told her anxiety came from unfulfilled longing, from her failure to embrace motherhood, or her ambivalence toward men, or her complicated desire to be seen not just as a wife or daughter or muse, but as a person. This wasn't cruelty, at least not in the way the Middle Ages had practiced it. It was something quieter, more insidious. A subtle insistence that even in this new world of analysis and talking cures, a woman's feelings could never be taken at face value. They had to be unpacked, dissected, reshaped into a narrative that Freud approved of. And so, even as couches replaced cages, the gaze remained the same. Male, analytical, controlling. And behind that gaze, women still ask the same question. Century after century, can I not simply feel this pain and be believed? The war was over. The world was rebuilding, breathing, reshaping itself. And for many, the 1950s brought the promise of peace, at least on the surface. In America, especially, the suburbs bloomed like well-watered flowers. Rows of identical houses lined clean streets, lawns were manicured. Dinner was served at 6, and inside these seemingly perfect homes lived women who were falling apart quietly. She had everything, they said. A husband, children, a washing machine, shiny appliances, a new station wagon. And yet, when she stood at the kitchen sink, her hands trembled. Her chest tightened, her heart pounded for reasons she couldn't name. She felt trapped, and worse, ungrateful, because the world told her she should be happy, that she had won the prize. But her body knew better. Her mind screamed behind her smile, and when she finally broke down, when she could no longer hide the tears or the silence or the weight in her chest, the doctor had one answer: a pill. They called it Mother's Little Helper. Milltown, then Valium. Small, smooth tablets that promised calm in a culture that refused to listen. These tranquilizers weren't offered because anyone asked what was wrong. They were given because it was easier than asking. Women were expected to be serene, and if they weren't, it was seen as a personal flaw, not a crisis, not a signal, just a smudge on the otherwise glossy image of domestic bliss. The ads were relentless. Magazine pages showed exhausted housewives clutching tissues, staring into mirrors, gripping countertops. The solution? A prescription. One ad even featured a woman barely holding herself together above a caption that read, "You can't set her free, but you can help her feel less trapped." That was the goal. Not liberation, not healing, just sedation. Doctors rarely asked questions. They simply wrote scripts, and women rarely had the language to explain what they were truly feeling, because no one taught them to name loneliness, or existential dread, or the grief of losing your identity inside a role that doesn't see you. So instead they said, "I feel tired," or "I get nervous," or "I just want to disappear sometimes." And the answer was always a pill. Millions of women were medicated, not because they were mentally ill, but because they were human in a world that didn't allow them to be. Their pain wasn't seen as valid. It was seen as inconvenient. And so, they smiled. They served dinner, they took the pill, and they swallowed their voices along with it. But somewhere, in the quiet corners of their minds, a question began to form. A dangerous, powerful question. What if I'm not broken? What if the problem isn't me, but everything I've been forced to carry alone? That question wouldn't find its answer right away, but it had been born. And in the next decade, it would begin to rise. The casseroles were still warm, the curtains still starched, the lawn still trimmed with precision, but something in the air had changed. By the late 1960s, the silent ache that had followed women through centuries of misunderstanding had begun to speak. Not with rage, not yet, but with clarity. With the sharp, aching clarity that comes from realizing you're not alone. A woman sits on a couch, a cigarette between her fingers, and says to another woman across the room, "I thought I was the only one." And that's where it begins. In living rooms, in church basements, on college campuses, in coffee shops with mismatched chairs. These weren't therapy sessions. They were something older, something raw. They were circles of truth. They called them consciousness-raising groups. The idea was simple. Gather, talk, and listen without interruption. Share what your days felt like, your thoughts, your fears. And slowly, in those circles, women began to see the patterns. That anxiety wasn't personal failure, that sadness wasn't weakness, that the panic rising in their throats was not an illness but a signal, a response to a life spent performing perfection under pressure. They realized they had been made into caretakers of everyone's emotions but their own. They had been sedated instead of listened to, prescribed silence in pill form. And now, finally, they had the words. Not just to name what they were feeling, but to question it. Why, they asked, was anxiety a condition in women but ambition was praised in men? Why were mothers medicated for burnout but never given help? Why did every woman they knew feel alone when clearly none of them were? Books became lifelines. The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan swept through households like wildfire. In its pages, women read their own thoughts, their own sleepless nights, their own sense of drifting through a life they were told they should be grateful for. Friedan called it the problem that has no name, that deep, aching emptiness beneath the performance of happiness. And for many, just hearing those words gave form to a feeling they'd never been allowed to say out loud. The movement was not just intellectual, it was visceral. Women began refusing prescriptions they didn't ask for. They demanded answers, demanded space, demanded dignity. They stopped apologizing for being tired, for being angry, for wanting more than quiet resignation. Therapists began to change too. Some, not all. The best ones didn't diagnose silence, they listened to it. They asked about childhood, about marriage, about rage and regret and lost dreams. Some were women themselves, new to the profession, but already shifting it from the inside. The changes weren't perfect. Misdiagnoses continued. Bias lingered, but something irreversible had begun. Women were no longer passive recipients of treatment. They were authors of their own narratives. For the first time in centuries, they weren't being spoken over, they were speaking back. And what they said was this: "My pain is not your theory, my fear is not your flaw, my anxiety is not hysteria, it is history, it is truth. It is the story I was never allowed to tell." By the 1980s, the vocabulary had finally begun to shift. Women's anxiety was no longer called nerves, or melancholy, or hysteria. Now it had clinical names: generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, post-traumatic stress. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, known simply as the DSM, grew thicker with each edition, filled with tidy criteria and coded language meant to bring precision to what had for centuries been vague and misjudged. But a label, no matter how scientific, doesn't always bring understanding. If you were a woman in 1993, sitting in a doctor's office, gripping the edge of your chair as waves of panic washed over you, you might be handed a brochure. It would list your symptoms: shortness of breath, racing heart, dizziness, a sense of dread. You'd nod. Yes, that was exactly it. Then the doctor would nod back, scribble a name at the top of a paper, and hand you a prescription: Xanax, maybe, or Clonopine, or Prozac, if your sadness overshadowed your fear. It felt like a relief. At last, someone believed you. But beneath that relief was a quiet, unanswered question: what now? Because while the science was advancing, the culture hadn't caught up. A woman who sought help was still often seen as fragile. If she cried during therapy, she was dramatic. If she didn't, she was withholding. She had to walk a tightrope, expressive but not too much, honest but not uncomfortable. The anxiety had a name, yes, but she still carried it alone. For those who could afford it, therapy was an option, but therapists varied wildly. Some were warm, validating, curious. Others barely looked up from their notebooks, asking about symptoms, but never about stories. They wanted to manage the disorder, not to understand the life wrapped around it. And for many women, the diagnosis felt double-edged. It explained things, but it also branded them. It whispered to employers, to partners, to families: "She's not just tired, she's unstable." And so, the old shame crept back in, dressed in modern language. Medications improved. SSRIs like Prozac and Zoloft became household names, marketed as miracles. Some truly helped. They softened the edges, gave space to breathe, but they came without a deeper conversation. Few doctors asked about childhood, or burnout, or the weight of generational expectations. The message was simple: take this and feel better. The pain was no longer a mystery. It was chemistry, imbalance, misfiring synapses. And yet, for many women, something about that explanation felt incomplete. Because even after the pills, the panic still returned. Maybe not as loud, but still present. The sense of being overwhelmed, of being on the verge of collapse, of carrying too much. Women began to wonder, was this really just a disorder? Or was it something else? A reflection, a warning, a history too long ignored. And beneath all the progress, beneath the insurance codes and the therapy sessions and the tidy diagnosis sheets, a deeper truth remained untouched. No one was asking why. The 21st century began not with silence, but with a buzz. A constant ping, a vibration in your pocket, a red dot waiting to be tapped. In this new world of broadband and smartphones, of endless feeds and instant updates, anxiety didn't disappear. It adapted. It slipped into our lives through glowing screens and infinite scrolls, weaving itself into the very fabric of our daily routines. Now, a woman's anxiety no longer needed a doctor's office. It showed up on her phone. She wakes to dozens of notifications, emails, messages, news alerts, calendar reminders. Her pulse quickens before her feet hit the floor. There's no time to think, no space to breathe. She's expected to be everything: responsive, informed, healthy, funny, creative, likable, desirable, calm. All before breakfast, and somewhere in that performance, her chest begins to tighten, but there's no room for it, not today. Anxiety in the digital era is constant, curated, and commodified. Posts with captions like, "My anxiety's really bad today," trend on social media, neatly packaged with pastel filters, soft fonts, and just enough self-deprecation to seem relatable, but not enough to be uncomfortable. Vulnerability becomes a brand. Pain becomes content. And healing becomes a checklist. Drink water. Journal. Meditate. Practice gratitude. Eat clean. Do yoga. Avoid negativity. Unfollow toxic people. Breathe, but not too loudly, because even in rest, there is pressure. The apps that promise peace also track your every move. Your meditation is timed, your breath is scored, your sleep is graphed. Even relaxation becomes another metric to optimize, another task to perform, a new form of quiet competition. And if you falter, if you break down, or ghost a friend or miss a deadline, it's not the system that's blamed. It's you. You didn't try hard enough. You didn't journal long enough. You didn't balance your nervous system with the right essential oils. The burden remains personal, internal. The pressure is invisible but everywhere. Women now face not only the old expectations to nurture, to succeed, to sacrifice, but also new ones. To be mentally resilient, emotionally intelligent, spiritually balanced, and always available. You're praised for being strong, but punished for being overwhelmed. You're encouraged to speak out, but only in a way that's tidy, digestible, never too much. And when the exhaustion catches up, when you break down in a bathroom stall or stare blankly at a glowing laptop screen, you wonder, what's wrong with me? But the better question is this: what if nothing is wrong with you at all? What if you're simply responding to a world that asks too much and gives too little? Because this kind of anxiety, this modern, silent, always-on kind, doesn't just live in the mind. It lives in the body, in the clenched jaw, the shallow breath, the scrolling thumb. And it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from centuries of being expected to hold it all together without complaint. But here's the quiet truth. Your anxiety is not a flaw. It is a signal, a flare in the night sky, a reminder that your nervous system wasn't built for this much noise. And in recent years, some women are starting to listen. They are logging off, saying no, letting the dishes wait, choosing rest not because they've earned it, but because they exist. Because they don't need to prove their worth through exhaustion anymore. Because they finally understand that burnout is not a badge. It's a warning. Communities are forming, not around perfection, but around honesty. Women gathering, online and off, to say, "Me too. I'm tired too." And in that shared breath, something radical happens. The pressure loosens, the silence lifts, the story changes. In this new century, women's anxiety has not vanished. It has only become more entangled with the noise of the world, and yet, amidst that digital static, something else has emerged. Not a cure, not a breakthrough, but a shift, a quiet, slow reclamation. Because after centuries of being told to calm down, to sit still, to smile through the storm, women are doing something far more radical. They are pausing. They are asking questions that generations before them were never allowed to ask. Not just, what's wrong with me? But who told me this is normal? And with that question comes another. What if rest is not failure? What if stillness is not shame? Now, across social platforms and podcasts, in late-night group chats and private journals, women are building a new kind of language around their inner lives. One that doesn't rush to fix but makes space to feel. A language that understands a tight chest and a spinning mind might not be a chemical error, but a message. A body trying to say, enough. They are learning that saying no isn't a collapse of duty, it's a declaration of boundary. That canceling plans doesn't make you unreliable, it makes you real. That needing time, needing space, needing silence is not weakness. It is wisdom passed down from the women who never got to ask for it. More and more, they are turning away from performance and toward presence. Not the curated version of healing, not the Instagrammable morning routine, but the messy, non-linear, deeply human process of facing the weight they've carried and choosing, slowly, softly, to set some of it down. Sometimes that looks like turning off the phone. Sometimes it means walking without purpose, crying without apology, laughing without guilt. Sometimes it's in the smallest acts, breathing with intention, sleeping without shame, saying, I'm not okay, and not needing a solution, just a witness. And in this slow shift, something long buried begins to stir.
Not rebellion, not revolution, but reclamation. A return to the truth that had been stolen over centuries of misdiagnosis and dismissal, that a woman's emotions are not evidence of her instability. They are evidence of her being alive in a world that often forgets how to treat aliveness with care. Something changed in the last 2 decades, not loud, not sudden, but undeniable. For the first time in recorded history, the world began to look not just at what women feel, but why. It wasn't always graceful. It wasn't always widespread, but it was real. In classrooms, clinics, and quiet corners of research labs, a new framework began to take root: trauma-informed care. It started with a question no one had thought to ask. What happened to you? Not what's wrong with you. Not why are you like this, but what have you survived? And with that question, the history of female anxiety finally began to fracture open. Because for generations, anxiety was treated as a defect, a chemical hiccup, a nervous quirk, something to medicate or minimize. But now, clinicians, educators, even social workers were starting to see the bigger pattern. That anxiety wasn't born in a vacuum. It was born in survival. In childhood homes where emotions were punished, not welcomed. In marriages where the word no was not respected. In cultures where women were expected to endure, not express. Science began to catch up with what women had always known in their bones. The body remembers. Trauma doesn't vanish, it lodges in the nervous system, alters the breath, sharpens the senses, traps the mind in patterns of vigilance and fear. That racing heart, that sense of impending doom, they weren't irrational. They were responses shaped by experience, by generations of silence. And so trauma became part of the conversation, not as a buzzword but as a lens. Therapists began to trace anxiety back to early attachment wounds, to inherited grief, to cultural violence. And suddenly, the diagnosis wasn't the end of the story, it was the door. Neuroscience, too, stepped into the light. Research on the amygdala, the vagus nerve, polyvagal theory, all of it confirmed that the anxious body was not broken. It was brilliant. It was trying to protect itself. Hypervigilance, a survival skill; dissociation, a shield; panic, the alarm system of a brain that had seen too much, too soon, and never been given safety. Women began to understand that their pain wasn't just personal, it was generational, passed down like family recipes but laced with fear. A grandmother who couldn't speak her mind, a mother who learned to please to stay safe, a daughter who inherited the silence and called it normal. And slowly, things began to shift. Therapists stopped pathologizing tears. They started asking about context, about lineage, about loss. Somatic practices, breathwork, body scanning, EMDR entered the room. Healing was no longer just talk, it was movement. It was reconnection. It was remembering what it meant to feel safe in your own skin. Outside the clinic, the conversation grew louder. Memoirs, podcasts, TikToks, women naming things that had once been nameless, emotional neglect, coercive control, medical gaslighting, workplace burnout. And in naming them, they removed the shame. They made space for others to step forward. A quiet revolution of language unfolded. Women stopped saying, "I'm crazy." They said, "I'm dysregulated." They stopped saying, "I'm just too sensitive." They said, "I have a nervous system responding to years of hypervigilance." It may seem small, semantic, but it isn't. It's seismic. Because every time a woman replaces blame with curiosity, silence with story, diagnosis with context, she rewrites centuries of misunderstanding. Once, healing was something you did quietly, alone, behind closed doors. You didn't talk about your panic attacks at dinner. You didn't say trauma in polite company. You didn't cry in public unless something terrible had happened, something tangible, something others could see and understand. But now, healing is leaving the shadows. It's showing up in poetry, in zines, in podcasts recorded under blankets at 2 a.m. It's in group chats named after survival. In music playlists called soft rage and crying in the car. In paintings that look like chaos but feel like truth. Healing is no longer a single path. It's a landscape, wide and open, made of story and sound and connection. Women are no longer waiting for permission to speak. They are creating their own stages, sharing their breakdowns on Instagram, writing essays that go viral not because they're polished, but because they're real. They're telling the truth in public. And not just the curated, inspirational truth, but the messy, trembling, in-process kind. They're saying, "I had a panic attack at work and no one noticed. I keep waking up at 3 a.m. thinking I've failed. I don't know how to rest without feeling guilty." And for the first time, the response isn't silence. It's a flood of "me too," of "I thought it was just me," of "thank you for saying it out loud." Because healing, it turns out, is contagious. It spreads through witness, through art, through vulnerability shared in brave, broken, beautiful ways. It's no longer something handed down by a doctor. It's something woven together in community. A collective quilt of stories, each patch stitched by a different hand but threaded with the same longing, to feel whole. And in this new space there is room for softness, room for rage, for nuance, for the truth that healing is not linear, that some days are full of light and others are just surviving until bedtime, that progress is not always visible, that relapse doesn't mean failure. There are circles now, virtual and physical, where women gather not to be fixed but to be heard, to sit with each other's stories without judgment, to cry without needing to explain why, to hold each other through the quiet unraveling that is healing. Workplaces are catching up, slowly. Some offer mental health days. Some train managers to recognize burnout. Schools are beginning to teach emotional regulation, not just arithmetic. Therapy is more accessible, though still not enough. But the cultural tide is turning. What was once shameful is now becoming sacred. What was hidden is becoming honored. This doesn't mean everything is better. The world still asks too much. The systems are still flawed, but something is shifting, because women are no longer waiting to be rescued from their anxiety. They are turning toward it, naming it, befriending it, and then reaching out to others and saying, "Come sit with me. You're not broken. You're just feeling too much in a world that rewards feeling nothing." Gen Z was born into a world already buzzing. They didn't discover the internet. They were born inside it. Their childhoods were bookmarked by global recessions, climate collapse, school lockdown drills, and the surreal intimacy of being online at all times. They've never known a world without a front-facing camera, without alerts, without comparison. Their anxiety didn't sneak up on them. It introduced itself early, made itself at home, and never left. But here's what's different. They talk about it. This is the generation that grew up with memes about trauma, group chats about panic attacks, and TikToks breaking down dissociation in 60 seconds or less. They are fluent in the language of therapy, before many have even been to therapy. They use words like boundaries, nervous system, reparenting, executive dysfunction, trauma response, and gaslighting with a fluency that once belonged only to clinical spaces. They are naming things their parents couldn't. Their grandparents weren't allowed to. They are interrupting centuries of silence. But it's not all aesthetic. It's not all mental health awareness with pastel graphics and guided meditations. Their openness often comes from necessity, because the pressure they face is relentless, social, economic, existential. They're expected to be hyperproductive, hyperpresent, hyperaware. They are bombarded with catastrophe and curated perfection at the same time. No wonder they're anxious. No wonder they're tired. And so, they're doing something many generations never had the language or freedom to do. They're opting out. They are walking away from the myth that burnout is noble. They are ghosting toxic workplaces, rejecting hustle culture, and publicly choosing softness over stoicism. They don't want to grind. They want to rest. Not just as self-care, but as rebellion. Not just for the sake of aesthetics, but survival. They are creating digital sanctuaries, Discord servers for neurodivergent teens, YouTube channels about healing inner children, TikToks showing how to breathe through a panic attack. There is noise, yes. There is misinformation. But there is also unprecedented access to each other's truth. Some say they're too sensitive, too fragile. But maybe sensitivity isn't the problem. Maybe it's the antidote. Maybe they are what happens when you raise a generation with access to not just knowledge, but each other. A generation who says, "I'm not okay," and means it. Who asks, "How are you really?" and waits for the real answer. They aren't perfect. They're still struggling, still drowning in systems that weren't built for their honesty. But they are no longer pretending. And in a world built on pretending, that's radical. Because Gen Z isn't just coping. They are demanding something better. And they are doing it in public. The future of healing isn't sterile. It doesn't live only in therapy rooms with beige walls and silent clocks. It's not always found in symptom checklists or 10-minute consultations. No, healing is beginning to look like something else entirely. It looks like movement. Like women dancing barefoot in community centers and candlelit studios, not to burn calories but to come back to their bodies, to feel what was once numbed, to shake loose what was once trapped. Somatic healing, once fringe, is now central because trauma doesn't just live in thoughts, it lives in muscles, in posture, in breath. And to heal it, you don't always need words. Sometimes you need to move. It looks like ritual. Not religious, not always, but sacred. Tiny ceremonies of self-respect. Lighting a candle before journaling. Speaking an affirmation out loud. Crying in the bath while playing a song that says exactly what you couldn't. Making grief into something visible. Making anxiety into something that can be held, not hidden. It looks like art. Not the gallery kind. The kitchen table kind. Women painting their fear. Stitching their memories into fabric. Writing poems that sound like survival, turning trauma into zines, songs, short films. Creativity, not as performance but as medicine. Because what wasn't allowed to be said is now being sung. It looks like community. Healing now happens in circles, in virtual rooms of strangers who feel like family. Group therapy, online workshops, retreats for Black women, indigenous land-based practices, queer chosen families. The old model said, "Go it alone." But the new way says, "Come as you are." You don't have to carry this in silence anymore. It looks like activism. Because for many, healing isn't personal, it's political. It means fighting for maternity leave, for gender-affirming care, for safe housing, for access to therapists who look like you and understand your story. It means healing the system, not just yourself. Because what good is inner peace in a world built on inequality? It looks like slowness, rejecting urgency, letting healing take time, letting it be nonlinear, letting yourself rest not because you finished the to-do list, but because you're worthy even when you do nothing. Letting yourself be instead of always becoming. And it looks like passing the torch. Women teaching their daughters that crying isn't weakness, that rest isn't laziness, that anxiety isn't shameful, that their bodies are not problems to solve but homes to inhabit. It looks like saying to the next generation, you don't have to repeat what we endured. You get to begin again. The future of healing is messy, slow, collective, embodied, and deeply human. It is a reclamation, a return, not to the past but to ourselves. There is no tidy ending to this story. Anxiety never vanished. It never apologized for staying. It never agreed to play by anyone's timeline. But maybe that was never the point. Maybe the point was this, that after centuries of being silenced, feared, mislabeled, and misunderstood, women are finally allowed to ask a better question. Not how do I get rid of this, but what is it trying to tell me? Because what if your anxiety was never a malfunction? What if it was a voice? A voice that no one taught you to hear. A voice that your ancestors were punished for listening to. A voice that says something isn't right here, even when everyone around you insists it is. And now, at last, we are listening. To the shallow breath before a decision. To the tight chest when a boundary is crossed. To the invisible weight of centuries pressing against a single woman's shoulders. We are no longer calling that weakness. We are calling it wisdom. And with that wisdom comes choice. Not the kind sold by self-help gurus or wrapped in five-step solutions, but real choice, quiet choice. The kind that says, I don't have to explain my fear to deserve safety. I don't have to hide my sadness to be worthy of joy. I don't have to burn out to prove that I care. I can be tired. I can rest. I can change my mind. I can live with anxiety and still build a beautiful life. Because the truth is, the world is still loud, still unkind, still asking women to hold more than they were ever meant to. But now, more than ever, women are holding each other, naming what was unnamed, honoring what was dismissed, softening where they once hardened, screaming where they once whispered. And in doing so, they're creating something that's never existed before. A world where a woman's panic is not a problem to solve, but a story to understand. A world where healing is not a destination, but a direction. A world where you don't have to be fixed, just met, just seen, just loved exactly as you are. That is the future. That is the quiet revolution. And it begins here, with you.